Assalamu alaikum, I'm Carl Arrindell and you're watching In Focus. I'm pleased to be joined today by one of the UK's leading political commentators and journalist, Peter Oborne. He's the associate editor of the Spectator and the former chief political commentator of the Daily Telegraph, from which he resigned earlier this year. He's author of The Rise of Political Lying and the Triumph of the Political Class. He's the co-author of the pamphlet Guilty Men. Michael White of the left, or should I say socially liberal Guardian newspaper, wrote of Peter Oborne's recent resignation from the Daily Telegraph, saying, and I quote, "It is easy to imagine the late Paul Foot, a fellow romantic but on the far left, applauding Oborne's stand. Investigative journalism survives in Fleet Street, including at the Telegraph, but whistleblowing is rarer. Like Foot, Oborne is not always right. He sometimes overstates his case, and hypocrisy can be seen as an easy target. But his polemical range has been eclectic and magnificent," he said. "In print and on TV, he has denounced Robert Mugabe, the pro-Europe lobby and the pro-Israel lobby, blamed our ills on postmodern relativism, defended Iran and the Human Rights Act, even said a good word for Ed Miliband, a courageous troublemaker then, always in short supply." Assalamu alaikum, Peter, and welcome to In Focus. So, Peter, do you see yourself as a serial whistleblower and a courageous troublemaker?
No, not at all, and I'm not. There are lots of people much more much more brave than me, because I think it's a very important point this. I travel around the world a lot, and I meet journalists in the Middle East, in Africa, who, in order to tell the truth, South Asia, in order to tell the truth, they're risking their lives and frequently get killed or tortured and imprisoned. So, here I am in West London, living a comfortable life. And so thank you for the compliment, but it would be absurd to accept it.
Well, I think you'll forgive me then for having that reference. But listen, I'm repeating what others have said. It's fair to say, though, isn't it, that you've been a staunch supporter of Conservative Party politics, even though at times you've been a harsh critic. And few will deny that you're a man of conscience. In fact, even Michael White of the left-wing Guardian praised you following your sensational and principled resignation from your post as chief political correspondent of the Daily Telegraph. He spoke of your powerful sense of right and wrong, which prompted you to leave your eminent perch at the Daily Telegraph in denunciation of the perceived lapse in their formal standards covering the HSBC scandal. Are we now witnessing generally in our press a demise of quality investigative journalism to be replaced by sort of material which simply serves commercial interests and is fearful of departing from the official discourse? Why was it important on this occasion, if at all, to resign?
Well, I do think there is a general problem which all newspapers are facing. If you go back even 10 years, but certainly 30 years, they're incredibly well funded. They had mass circulations, that advertising flowed in, and they had big budgets. And now, with the kind of social media competition, the circulations have plunged, the advertising is worth much less, and the budgets are falling all the time. So it's difficult to fund. Investigative journalism is expensive. It requires loads of resources. There's still some magnificent examples of it, by the way, but it's very difficult to fund. There is and also, I think if one say just about me personally, I'm just old. I don't have the same financial responsibilities I had 20 years ago, and it was easier to make a sort of principled decision than it is for somebody, without falling off a cliff financially, because you just got a little bit more of a lot more indeed of a sort of cushion. And so there are all sort of personal reasons why one can make apparently brave decisions. So but I do. On the other hand, I think the key, the question, is how you are going to adjust. How you're going to find ways. Young journalists are going to find ways of being, doing that investigative work, which the legacy of Harold Evans at the Sunday Times.
I suppose we've now got a new plethora of social media outlets that are springing up and so-called citizen journalism. Is that dangerous?
It is a bit, because does it have the disciplines and the rigour and just the sheer time and the experienced people overseeing it, which was the case of the great famous Harold Evans at the Sunday Times in the 60s, with his enormous, amazing investigations, whole teams sort of doing nothing else for years, and then coming up with the truth about Philby the spy, or about thalidomide. So it's a good question.
Now, we've just come to the end of a grueling 5-6 weeks of election campaigning, and it seems that we will see the formation, I think, if everything works out, of a majority Conservative government, which surprised even the most seasoned pundits. Statistics suggest that the voter turnout was 66+%, the highest recorded since the landslide victory of Tony Blair in 1997. I think he got 71.4 or so % of the population voting at that time. Yet there are many who remain outside our electoral system, who choose not to vote on the basis that the policies, the political figures, the parties do not offer or represent their concerns. It would seem that historically, and notably in the 2010 election, for which we've got data, a lower percentage of British Muslims are becoming more and more dissatisfied and disengaged. There's a lower percentage of British Muslims voting than any other religious group. Do you see this as a problem with the current democratic model? Is there another explanation?
I definitely agree with what you're saying. I think about 50% of British Muslims voted in 2010, and that's much less than the national average. And I'd like to see what the figures for this election were. But I was very concerned indeed about the way, in particular, the Conservatives fought this election, because if you remember, it was kicked off with that speech by Mrs. May, the Home Secretary, which was targeting Muslims for bigotry. I know that she has the category of a virtuous Muslim who isn't bigoted, but it was a good versus bad Muslim argument, highlighting Muslims generally as a problem. I felt that was a very sensitive speech to make, and to make it on the eve of a general election was an outrage. Plus the fact that, and dangerous, plus the fact that the Conservatives didn't try and cultivate the Muslim vote. I think I'm right in saying that Mr. Cameron didn't go near a mosque. I think I'm right in saying that George Osborne, who was the campaign chief, has never ever been in a mosque. Anyway, I asked his advisor whether he'd ever been in a mosque, and he's been unable to provide an example of such a thing happening. And yet the Conservatives were very assiduous again to seek Hindu temples. The Jewish vote was very carefully.
So why is that?
I think what they have said is that the Muslim vote is just basically not going to vote Conservative anyway, and that's an outrageous thing to think, because I've talked a great deal about this with learned figures, of men, which has been doing good work, and they are pointing out that Muslims are hardworking, family-minded, very family-minded. In fact, they embody quite a lot of conservative values, much more than some conservatives.
What was Lord Ashcroft's findings in this respect? I know he did some research.
I haven't seen his lordship's findings on the Muslim vote, I can't say, but what I would say is that insofar as the Muslim vote figured in the Conservative campaign, the Muslims figured as a target, almost as victims, and this, I think, is very troubling. And I worry very much that the incoming Conservative government will send a message that Muslims aren't wanted in mainstream democratic discourse. And that is terrible in a democracy, that a minority.
You talk about messages being sent literally minutes after it was reasonably certain that the Conservative Party had won a majority. The Home Secretary Theresa May made some statements in her first comments to the media. She spoke about the freedom that she was now able to experience in being able to pass without limitations imposed by former coalition partners on bringing into force the extra powers to counter terrorism. She was celebrating the fact that she was now going to move forward in scrapping the Human Rights Act. Now, I know that you have been very outspoken on some of these issues, and I'm going to quote you. I think you said, as far as the Human Rights Act is concerned, that they are absolutely fundamental to the British common law tradition. They include the right to life, the prohibition of torture, rights to liberty and security of person, the right to a fair trial, the right to respect the private and family life, crucially, rights to freedom of expression and religion. You said these rights are not radical, they are deeply conservative. How can Muslims be expected to play a meaningful role as stakeholders in British society in the context of these proposals, and taking into account what you've said about this, what you see this dangerous theme of targeting Muslims rather than making them inclusive?
Well, I think it is worth observing, first of all, that we all have, I think, in a modern Britain, 21st century Britain, multiple identities. And so the Muslim identity of a British voter, or the Jewish identity, or the white identity, or the black identity, is only a relatively small part, I hope, of what we are as British citizens. You know, we are above everything else, we're British, and we're all Brits, and we vote as Brits. And of course, there's, you know, in my case, I come from the West Country, you know, and that counts for a bit, and I'm a German. We all have numerous, you know, you've got a West Indian heritage, and all that plays its role. So it's not the only thing. I've met lots of Muslims who voted Conservative because they admired the economic policies of the government. That's fine, you know. Nevertheless, I worry. I worry that something odd is not so much odd as invidious is going on, and I think the Conservatives have to be careful not to disenfranchise effectively whole communities.
Now, you, in a recent presentation, I think just in the days leading up to the election, you made a presentation about political engagement. And you made the statement, and I'm going to quote you, you said that the Conservative Party has developed a model of political engagement which has nothing to offer many Muslims who want to get involved in mainstream politics. Indeed, there are many, I would say, who believe that Muslims who do attempt to engage in mainstream politics are then likely to be subject to accusations of entryism, cronyism, corruption and extremism and so on, which seems to be happening. I'm referring in particular to the government interventions, Eric Pickles and so on, in Muslim-run schools and the legal processes around the overthrow, as some have described it, of the mayor of Tower Hamlets. What do you see as the long-term, medium and long-term implications of this continued demonisation in respect of Muslims and their growing hopeless disaffection?
I think the problem is that the prevent strategy does this as well, and one suspects that Mrs May will sort of harden that up now that the Lib Dems have left government. But the sends a message: the more Muslim you are, the more somehow undesirable or non-British you are, and this is a troubling. It's a false message. It's not true. You can be very Muslim, you can pray 5 times in a day and go to the mosque regularly and be devout and be totally British. And I think that it's a danger that is not being felt. And I think that some of the actions of the government, the new government, have sent out that out. And I worry very strongly about that over time you're going to move into a situation where there's a community is disenfranchised. The Luther Rathman case, which you just referred to, now he's been absolutely pilloried in the press, and he's pilloried by this report by this barrister. I don't think he's a judge, Richard Morey QC. Now I was very it highlights an issue that if Muslims, there is a body of Muslim opinion which says don't vote. That might be Al Qaeda, which says that democracy is just a scam, or it might be a Hizb ut-Tahrir, which sort of says that voting is haram. I think I'm right in saying. And then you get Muslims who do get involved. Now, I've read some of the reports by Ruta Ratman, and some of the accusations seem to me odd. One of them is that he rewards his supporters. Hello. And that is what political parties do. I mean, Danny Alexander's Highlands, when he was chief secretary, I mean, there were endless sort of lovely things happened to Highlanders. I don't know whether it was a pure coincidence that Mr. Alexander, whose loss I mourn as an MP, was chief secretary. Look, this kind of stuff goes on. This is how politics works in a democracy. Purists may not like it. That's what happens. And so if Mr. Rahman rewarded his supporters, all he was doing was following the slightly debased political tradition which all parties have adhered to for hundreds of years in this country. I was yet more troubled by this claim that somehow he had inflicted spiritual injury on his supporters or threatened.
Or use spiritual influence. Yeah.
Use spiritual. This is fabulous. And if you look at this was revisiting a 19th century law, and the context is very interesting. This law was was produced in the wake of the secret ballot, when Irish voters suddenly were able not to be scrutinised by their landlords. They tended to be Catholics, and there was a fear that the priests would somehow stir up these peasants against the benign Anglican ascendancy in Ireland. Now, it's very political. These are very deep waters, and the language which the English elite in the 19th century used about these Irish peasants was extremely racist and ugly. And they were categorising one section of Britain, which Ireland was then part of, as being inferior. There was a racist take. And I don't know whether Richard Morey QC, how familiar with what he was, these deep waters he was entering, but he was clearly making similar imputations, or open to the charge, he was making similar imputations about the Bangladeshi community in East London.
Well, I'm just going to quote you some of his words. I mean, from his statement, he said, "In carrying out the assessment, a distinction must be made between a sophisticated, highly educated and politically literate community and a community which is traditional, respectful of authority and possibly not fully integrated with the other communities living in the area."
This is very much echoes the language of the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland in the 19th century, occupying, which was seen by the Irish today still as an occupation.
And can that be acceptable in the 21st century?
Well, I think that, in other words, I think what we're saying here, I don't know enough about it, but I think it does raise questions about that report into Mayor Rahman. I don't know all the details.
Now, finally, quite shocking, surprisingly, I say, we've seen a raft of resignations in the opposition parties since the announcement of the victory of the Conservatives in this election. We've had the leader of the Labour Party, leader of the Lib Dems. We've had a wipeout of most of the senior figures of the Liberal Democrats in Parliament. Even Ed Balls, lost his seat. Does that mean that we have an ineffective opposition, and is that healthy for democracy?
I agree with you. I think Labour is going to be convulsed with a internal battle for the next couple of years. The Lib Dems have vanished without trace. The Scottish National Party perceives itself to be a Scottish party. I don't know how much it's going to be able to. I hope it can. How much it will want to engage in national debate. So, what is the opposition? I think that David Cameron, the Prime Minister, is in a position of remarkable strength. I mean, I think
more so than probably any leader for a long time.
Well, more so. I mean, Tony Blair had it briefly in '97 and was afraid to use his political strength in many ways. I think Mr. Cameron has got an enormous position of strength, and I think he will try and use it. I think he's going to surprise us with a lot of unexpected measures to really utilise this situation in the next few months. I don't think it's fully understood quite how dramatic the election was and how powerful the British Prime Minister now is. And he will know, he's experienced enough and he's seen enough not to make the mistake of Tony Blair, which was to not use his strength when he had it.
What does that mean for communities, minority communities like the Muslim community?
Yeah.
We spoke earlier on about some of the rhetoric that we've already heard coming from the Home Secretary. The fact that there is no restricting influence of a coalition partner, for better or for worse. What is that going to mean for the mass population out there who didn't necessarily support this government?
Well, I like the speech which Mr. Cameron made, a victory speech. I thought it was graceful, and I like the way he talked about one nation. On the other hand, if Mrs. May, who quite frankly has made some comments which were barking mad during the campaign, is allowed to carry on untrammeled, I think that the Muslim community is entitled to be worried, because I think what the direction they are going down is criminalising and turning into even to terrorist offences kinds of behaviour which are private matters. And are you going to be turned into a criminal simply for being a good Muslim? That is some of the things which are said by Conservative ministers and their supporters in these rather curious think tanks which float around Westminster might suggest that's going to happen. So I can assure you, Mr. Arrindell, that I personally intend to take a very close interest in this matter in the months and years ahead, and to highlight them. I expect to come back on your programme and tell you what I've discovered.
Well, I would say that you'd be most welcome. We're very much looking forward to those exchanges. Peter, it's been a real pleasure, as it always is, talking with you. Thank you so much for joining us on Islam Channel.
Thank you very much indeed.